Alright, this video is the first of the American Revolution. We're going to talk about French fur trappers today. It's hard to believe that fur trappers play such an important role in the history of the United States. It actually starts with our favorite failed economic policy, mercantilism. Mercantilism is the idea of tying a nation's wealth or power to increasing exports and decreasing imports. And again, I've discussed how this is terrible policy, but let's look at it a little further. So again, mercantilism is the concept that a country's power is tied to having a favorable balance of trade. Mercantilists wanted to import less and export more. And this plays out in the colonies. All of these dots are fur trappers. They're fur trapping outposts. You can see that they're in Canada mainly, but they're also in what is now the United States of America. And all of these fur trappers are run by the French. Meanwhile, up and down the east coast of what is modern day North America, the United States of America, is held by Britain. Now, if you're Britain and you're a mercantilist and you see that these French are trapping all of these furs and they're running them down the Mississippi River, out the port of New Orleans, around the tip of Florida, and back to Europe and selling them for lots and lots of money, you're going to get a little bent out of shape about that, especially if you're a mercantilist. Mercantilists see that this is helping the French and they're doing it in their land, and that's going to make them mad enough to start a war. And that's the number one problem with mercantilism: increased conflict. During the mercantilist period, military conflict between nation states was more frequent and more extensive than any time in history. And in fact, you're going to see this theme from the French and Indian War all the way to the Declaration of Independence. Mercantilism comes up over and over again. In order to put this in terms that an 8th grader can understand, wars destroy wealth, and specifically during this time period, money that was made from trade was almost always squandered by war. So they would make all of this money because they still were kind of free traders, but then they would just squander it away. And this was the most interesting thing that I learned. During this era, draining another country of gold and silver was viewed as beneficial trade. So not only would you increase your exports and decrease your imports, but you would also try and steal things from the French and lower their balance. This was seen as powerful. This is a little less important, but it's also important. Trade is always a win-win. Okay, trade is almost always a win-win. There are some situations where it's not a win-win, but free trade is typically always a win-win. When you go and purchase milk, you would rather have the milk from the store than you would the $3.49, and the store would rather have the $3.49 than they would the milk. Again, if you want to go bigger, iPhones, you would rather have a $4.99 iPhone than you would the $4.99. Most people make this trade without even thinking twice. The last problem with mercantilism is what we call economies of scale. Some areas of the world have geographical and resource advantages in more areas than others do. This will make more sense as I get to it. For example, the best example was it would be a terrible career to be a saltwater fisherman in the state of Indiana. There's no saltwater around. So Indiana has a very low output of saltwater fishermen because they basically don't have any saltwater. Whereas Florida, if you're a saltwater fisherman, is a great place to live. On a bigger scale, Asia, something just blew up. Asia is an industrial powerhouse because it should say 5/7, and you'd think I'd fix that by now, but I haven't. 5/7 of the world population lives in the Eastern Hemisphere, so they don't have to just simply shipping things to people is hard for Americans because a majority of your customers live 3,000 miles away. Mercantilism is effectively ended with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. This is just a joke, okay? So sometimes jokes are funny. Just relax. All right. So back to the French and Indian War. The British are bent out of shape because the French are stealing their fur trapping. So they passed a series of acts, and the acts are aimed at the colonies only trading with Great Britain. The Navigation Acts specifically target the colonies and force them to trade with Great Britain. They also do a couple other things, like if the colonies wanted to ship something to South America, they'd have to take it all the way to Britain, where they would tax it and then ship it to South America. It's also very hard to enforce those laws because you're 3,000 miles away, which that's foreshadowing again. All right, the French and Indian War breaks out, and it's actually a proxy war. And what that means is it's kind of like a satellite war. The French and Indian War breaks out in the colonies, and it's called the 7 Years' War in Europe. So if you're in Europe and you're talking about the French and Indian War, they'll refer to it as the 7 Years' War, whereas here in America, it's the French and Indian War. The war erupts, and a lot of people, this is the hardest part about the French and Indian War. Number one, it's the French and the Indians versus the colonists and the British. It's not the French versus the Indians. It's the French and the Indians versus the colonists and the British. All right. Now that we've cleared that up, battles and all that stuff, not really important. Two things are important about the French and Indian War. The most important thing is that it is literally point zero of the United States of America. The British fight a war here and there, and they go into debt. And when they go into debt, they have to pay for that debt. And when they pay for that debt, they tax the colonists. The other thing that's important is that George Washington, he really gains a lot of military experience during the French and Indian War, enough to kind of give him a foundation to become the military leader that he's going to become later. All right, that's it. That's part one, the French and Indian War. We're going to talk about new taxes next.